The unmarked sedan pulled to a stop outside a modest brick apartment building in Louisville's Highlands neighborhood, its engine ticking softly in the cold February morning of 2024. Detective Sarah Chin sat behind the wheel for a long moment, her hands gripping tight, staring at the third-floor window where warm light glowed behind curtains that looked handmade. 13 years. 13 years this person had lived here, paid rent on time, smiled at neighbors in the hallway, existed in plain sight, while Grace Hartley lay in Cave Hill Cemetery and her mother Linda waited for answers that seemed like they would never come. Chen took a breath, checked the arrest warrant one more time, and nodded to her partner, Detective James Rodriguez. They stepped out into the bitter cold, their breath visible in the pre-dawn air. This was the day that would shatter everything this community thought they knew about the people living among them, the day that would prove DNA doesn't forget and time doesn't erase what you've done. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Cases like this take years of research and investigation to bring you, and your support helps us tell the stories that deserve to be told, the ones about victims who should never be forgotten. The call had come through to the Louisville Metro Police Department at 10:17 on a Friday night in September of 2011, the kind of late summer evening when Kentucky heat finally breaks and the air turns soft with the promise of autumn. Linda Hartley's voice was shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask her twice to repeat herself. Her daughter Grace hadn't come home from school. She always came straight home on Fridays because they had their ritual, pizza and a movie night, just the two of them in their small house on Highland Avenue. Grace never missed it. She'd never stay out without calling, never go somewhere without telling her mother where she'd be. Linda had called Grace's cell phone 17 times and it went straight to voicemail. She'd called Grace's best friend, Emma, who said Grace had left school at the normal time, said she was heading home like always. She'd called the boy Grace had been dating, Tyler Morrison, who hadn't seen her since lunch period. Something was wrong, Linda told the dispatcher, her voice rising with panic that mothers know in their bones when their children are in danger. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The responding officers took the report seriously because Linda Hartley wasn't the type to panic over nothing. She was known in the Highlands as steady, practical, a single mother who'd raised Grace alone since her husband died of cancer when Grace was 7. Linda worked as a dental hygienist at a clinic on Bardstown Road, the kind of person who showed up early and stayed late, who sent cards to patients after major procedures, who remembered everyone's names and asked about their families. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't prone to overreaction. When Linda Hartley said something was wrong, the officers believed her. They began checking the route Grace would have walked home, a path she took 5 days a week for the past 2 years, so familiar she could probably walk it with her eyes closed. Grace Hartley was 15 years old in September of 2011, a sophomore at DuPont Manual High School, who occupied that particular space of adolescence where childhood and adulthood overlap in complicated ways. She was quiet but not shy, the kind of girl who observed more than she spoke, who noticed details other people missed and translated them into art. Her sketchbooks were filled with drawings of the neighborhood, careful pencil studies of the Victorian houses that lined Highland Avenue, portraits of the regulars at the coffee shop where she and Emma would sit for hours, pages and pages of hands because she said hands were the hardest thing to draw. And she was determined to master them. She wanted to study graphic design in college, talked about moving to Chicago or maybe Portland, cities with vibrant art scenes where she could make a life doing something she loved. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, wore oversized flannel shirts and Chuck Taylors that she decorated herself with, Sharpie drawings, carried a messenger bag covered in pins from bands she loved and causes she believed in. She volunteered every Saturday at the animal shelter on Frankfort Avenue, mainly with the cats, because she loved how independent they were, how they chose you rather than the other way around. She'd wanted to adopt one, but their landlord didn't allow pets, so instead she'd spent her Saturdays cleaning cages and socializing the shy ones and taking photos for the adoption website. She was good with the scared animals, patient in a way that surprised the adult volunteers. She'd sit quietly until they came to her, never forcing connection, understanding that trust had to be earned. Her best friend Emma Chen had known Grace since 4th grade, one of those friendships that forms early and deepens over time until the two girls could communicate in half sentences and shared looks. They'd been inseparable through middle school, navigating the complicated social hierarchies of adolescence together, spending weekends having sleepovers where they'd stay up too late, watching old movies that Grace loved, Breakfast at Tiffany's and Roman Holiday. Classics that most teenagers thought were boring, but Grace found romantic in a way she couldn't quite explain. Emma was louder, more outgoing, the one who pulled Grace into social situations she'd otherwise avoid. But Grace grounded Emma, reminded her to slow down, to notice beauty in quiet moments, to think before speaking. The boy Grace had been dating, Tyler Morrison, was new to the equation that fall. They met in art class at the start of sophomore year, bonded over a shared love of street art and arguments about whether Banksy was a genius or overrated. Tyler played guitar in a terrible garage band and had the kind of earnest intensity that 15-year-old girls find compelling. They'd been on exactly 4 dates, if you could call them that. Walks through Cherokee Park where they'd sit on the rocks by the creek and talk for hours. One trip to see a band play at Highlands Coffee. Group hangouts that were carefully casual because neither wanted to make too big a deal of what there was developing between them. Grace had told Emma she thought she might be falling for him, said it with the kind of wonder and terror that comes with first love. Linda had liked Tyler when she met him, thought he seemed respectful and genuine, the kind of boy who looked her in the eye and called her Mrs. Hartley, even though she'd told him Linda was fine. But she'd also felt that particular fear that mothers of teenage daughters know, the awareness that your child is growing into someone separate from you, making choices you can't control, moving through a world that isn't always safe. She'd had the talk with Grace about being careful, about trusting her instincts, about calling any time, day or night, if she ever felt uncomfortable or needed help. Grace had rolled her eyes the way teenagers do, said Mom, "I know, I'm not stupid." But she'd also hugged Linda tight and promised she'd always be careful. The Highlands neighborhood where the Hartleys lived was the kind of place that felt safe, a close-knit community of old houses and local businesses where people walked to the farmers' market on Saturday mornings and knew their neighbors by name. Bardstown Road ran through the heart of it, lined with quirky shops and restaurants and the independent bookstore where Grace loved to browse. It was the kind of neighborhood where parents felt comfortable letting their teenagers have independence, where kids could walk home from school or meet friends at the coffee shop without constant supervision. The community had a rhythm, a sense of shared responsibility, and people looked out for each other in the casual way that neighbors do. September 23rd, 2011, was a Friday that should have been completely ordinary. Grace had gone to school that morning like always, kissed her mother goodbye at 7:15, walked the 6 blocks to DuPont Manual with her messenger bag slung across her shoulder and her earbuds in, listening to whatever indie band she was currently obsessed with. Emma remembered seeing her between classes, making plans to hang out Sunday afternoon. Tyler had sat with her at lunch, remembered her seeming happy, normal, excited about the weekend. Her art teacher, Mrs. Between Classes, Richardson, had complimented a portrait Grace was working on, said she had real talent, should seriously consider art school. Grace's last class ended at 3:30, and multiple students remembered seeing her leave the building, heading toward the main entrance like she did every day. The walk from DuPont Manual to the Hartley house on Highland Avenue was roughly 1.5 miles, a route Grace had walked hundreds of times. Down Ardmore Avenue to Bardstown Road, then north through the commercial strip of the Highlands, past the coffee shop and the bookstore and the vintage clothing place she liked to browse, then right on to Highland Avenue and 3 blocks to home. On a normal day, it took her about 30 minutes, sometimes longer if she stopped to look in shop windows or ran into someone she knew. Security camera footage from a business on Bardstown Road showed her walking past at 3:45, headphones in, looking at her phone, completely normal. That was the last confirmed sighting of Grace Hartley alive. When she wasn't home by 6, Linda started to worry. When she wasn't home by 7, Linda was calling everyone she could think of. When she wasn't home by 8, Linda was in her car driving the route Grace would have walked, looking for any sign of her daughter, calling her name out the window like somehow Grace would hear and come running. By 9:30, Linda was back home because what if Grace came back and she wasn't there, pacing the small living room, calling Grace's phone over and over just to hear her voice on the voicemail message, "Hey, it's Grace, leave me a message and I'll call you back." Except she wouldn't call back. She couldn't. By the time Linda called the police at 10:17, her voice shaking with the kind of fear that lives in every parent's nightmares, Grace had been missing for more than 6 hours. The officers who responded immediately began organizing a search, calling in additional units, setting up a command center in the parking lot of Highlands Coffee, where the owner stayed open late to provide coffee for the searchers. The community mobilized with the kind of speed that shows how much people cared. Neighbors emerged from their homes with flashlights. Emma's parents and Tyler's parents joined the search. Teachers from DuPont Manual showed up. Store owners on Bardstown Road closed up and grabbed flashlights. By midnight, there were more than 100 people combing the Highlands, calling Grace's name, checking alleys and parking lots and anywhere a teenage girl might be if she was hurt or hiding or lost. Linda walked with the searchers even though the police had suggested she stay home in case Grace called or came back. She couldn't sit still, couldn't wait, needed to be doing something even though every step felt like moving through water, even though her mind was playing the worst possibilities on repeat. She kept thinking about how Grace had seemed that morning, perfectly normal, complaining about a history test, asking if they could get the pizza with extra cheese. She kept thinking about the last thing she'd said to Grace, some mundane reminder to text when she got home from school. She should have said, "I love you." She should have hugged her tighter. She should have done 1,000 things differently if she'd known that morning would be the last normal moment they'd ever have. Detective Marcus Webb caught the case that first night, a 20-year veteran of the Louisville Metro Police Department who specialized in missing persons. He was methodical and thorough, the kind of investigator who believed in following procedure and trusting evidence over hunches. He interviewed Linda at her home while the search continued, getting details about Grace's routine, her friends, her state of mind, anything that might help locate her. Linda answered questions through tears, her voice raw from calling Grace's name. No, Grace wasn't depressed. No, she wouldn't run away. No, there was no trouble at school or with friends. Grace was happy, or as happy as any 15-year-old navigating the complicated terrain of adolescence. She had no reason to disappear. Webb checked Grace's phone records, seeing nothing unusual in the hours before she vanished. Texts with Emma about homework. A message to Tyler saying she'd call him later. A text to her mother at 2:30 saying school was fine, see you tonight. Her social media showed a normal teenage girl's life. Photos with friends, complaints about homework, excitement about concerts and movies. There were no threatening messages, no signs of an online predator, no indication that Grace was planning to meet anyone or go anywhere besides straight home. Her bank account showed no activity. Her few credit cards hadn't been used. Everything pointed to a girl who'd simply vanished between the coffee shop on Bardstown Road and her house 3/4 of a mile away. The search continued through the night and into Saturday morning, expanding outward from Grace's normal route. Volunteers checked Cherokee Park, where Grace loved to spend time sketching, walking the trails and calling her name into the woods. They checked the Big Four Bridge and the waterfront park. They checked every business along Bardstown Road, asking if anyone had security footage from Friday afternoon. They checked parking garages and abandoned buildings. They checked everywhere they could think of, while the hours ticked by and the terrible statistics about missing persons began weighing on everyone's mind. The first 48 hours are critical. After that, the chances of finding someone alive dropped dramatically. Everyone knew this, even if nobody said it out loud. By Saturday evening, the story was leading the local news. Grace's school photo appeared on every channel. A girl with dark hair and gray eyes and a slight smile, looking younger than 15, looking like someone's daughter who should be home safe. The community held a vigil in Cherokee Park, hundreds of people with candles singing Amazing Grace and praying for her safe return. Linda stood in the center of it, surrounded by neighbors and strangers who wanted to help, and felt more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. Her daughter was out there somewhere, and she couldn't find her, couldn't protect her, couldn't do the one thing a mother is supposed to do, which is keep her child safe. On Sunday morning, September 25, 2011, two joggers running trails in Cherokee Park found Grace's body in a wooded area about 50 yards off the main path. The joggers called 911, their voices shaking, saying they found a girl. She wasn't moving. Please send someone quickly. Officers arrived within minutes and secured the scene, calling for the homicide unit, calling for the medical examiner, calling Detective Webb, who'd been expecting this call since Saturday afternoon when Grace had been missing for 24 hours, hoping against hope that he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. Grace Hartley hadn't run away or gotten lost. Someone had taken her life, stolen everything she was and everything she would have been, and left her in the woods like she was nothing when she was everything to the people who loved her. The news reached Linda Hartley at 11:30 on Sunday morning. delivered by Detective Webb in her living room where she'd been sitting in the same spot since Friday night, waiting for her phone to ring with good news that would never come. Webb sat across from her, his face grave, and spoke the words that would split Linda's life in two before and after, the moment when hope died and grief moved in to stay forever. Grace had been found. She wasn't alive. Linda remembered screaming, remembered the sound coming from somewhere deep inside her that didn't feel human, remembered Webb's partner catching her as her legs gave out. She remembered thinking this had to be a mistake, had to be someone else's daughter, because Grace was supposed to come home, they were supposed to have pizza and movie night, they were supposed to have decades more together. But it wasn't a mistake. Grace was gone. And the world Linda had known for 15 years ended in that living room on a Sunday morning while autumn sunshine streamed through windows that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The scene in Cherokee Park was controlled chaos, yellow crime scene tape cordoning off a section of woods while forensic teams worked with meticulous precision to document everything. Grace had been found in a small clearing surrounded by oak trees, a place she might have chosen herself if she'd been there to sketch. Beautiful and quiet and utterly wrong as the location where her life ended. The medical examiner would later determine she'd been dead since Friday evening, killed within hours of her disappearance, which meant all that searching through Friday night and Saturday had been searching for someone who was already gone. The cause of death was strangulation, violence that spoke of rage or desperation or something dark that Detective Webb had seen too many times in his career. There was evidence of sexual assault, details that would be kept from the public and from Linda as much as possible, because some things a mother shouldn't have to know about her daughter's final moments. The forensic team collected evidence with painstaking care, photographing everything from multiple angles, marking items with numbered yellow tags, carefully preserving anything that might tell them who had done this. They found Grace's messenger bag about 10 feet from her body, its contents scattered, her sketchbook open to a half-finished drawing of the park bandstand. Her cell phone was missing, never recovered despite extensive searches. Her house keys were found in the leaves nearby. Most importantly, the medical examiner and forensic team collected DNA evidence from Grace's body and clothing, biological material that didn't belong to her, genetic traces left behind by whoever had killed her. It was carefully packaged, cataloged, and sent to the Kentucky State Police Lab for analysis. This DNA would be the key to eventually solving the case. But in September of 2011, it was just evidence without a name attached, a profile that would be run through CODIS, the national DNA database, yielding no matches and leaving investigators with genetic material from a killer who'd never been arrested for anything requiring DNA collection. Detective Webb approached the investigation with the systematic thoroughness that had solved dozens of cases over his career. He interviewed everyone in Grace's orbit, starting with the people closest to her and expanding outward in concentric circles. Emma Chen sat in an interview room at the police station with her parents beside her, crying as she answered questions about Grace's state of mind, her relationships, whether she'd mentioned anyone making her uncomfortable. Emma couldn't think of anyone, said Grace had been happy lately, excited about the art class she was taking, about spending time with Tyler, about absolutely normal teenage things. She felt guilty for not walking home with Grace that Friday, even though they lived in opposite directions and Emma always took the bus. She kept saying she should have been there, should have protected her best friend, even though there was nothing she could have done. Tyler Morrison was interviewed multiple times, first at his home with his parents present, then at the station, then again as Webb worked to establish a timeline and verify alibis. Tyler had been at band practice Friday afternoon from 4 until 6:30, confirmed by 3 other band members and the garage owner who let them practice in his space. After practice, he'd gone home, had dinner with his family, played video games in his room until around 10 when his mother told him to go to bed. His alibi was solid, backed by multiple witnesses and his parents' testimony. Webb could see the devastation on Tyler's face, genuine grief from a 15-year-old boy who'd been falling for a girl and now had to process that she was gone. Tyler wasn't a suspect, just another victim of Grace's murder in a different way, someone who'd carried this loss into adulthood and always wonder what might have been if she'd lived. Webb interviewed teachers at DuPont Manual, asking if anyone had shown inappropriate interest in Grace, if there'd been any incidents or concerns. Her art teacher, Mrs. Richardson, cried during the interview, said Grace had been one of the most talented students she'd taught in 20 years, said losing her felt like losing part of what made teaching worthwhile. The school counselor said Grace had never reported any problems, no bullying or harassment, nothing that raised red flags. The principal authorized Webb to review security footage showing the hallways and exits, and Webb watched Grace walk out the main entrance at 3:32, alone, looking at her phone, completely unaware that she had less than an hour left to live. The neighborhood canvas produced dozens of interviews but few useful leads. A woman who lived on Highland Avenue thought she'd heard raised voices coming from the direction of the park around 6 o'clock Friday evening but couldn't be certain. Might have been teenagers being loud, might have been nothing. A man walking his dog near the park entrance around 5:30 remembered seeing a dark sedan parked on the street. Didn't think much of it at the time, couldn't recall the make or model or license plate, just that it seemed out of place because most people parked in the lot. A teenager remembered seeing Grace walking on Bardstown Road around the time the security footage captured her, said she seemed normal, had her earbuds in, wasn't with anyone. None of these fragments connected into anything solid, just isolated pieces of information that might mean something or might be completely irrelevant. Webb and his team looked at registered sex offenders living in the area, standard procedure for any case involving a young victim. They identified 6 men within a 2-mile radius who'd been convicted of various sex crimes, brought each one in for questioning, verified their whereabouts Friday afternoon and evening. 2 had solid alibis. 3 had alibis that were somewhat soft but checked out under scrutiny. 1 had been in jail on an unrelated charge and couldn't have been involved. None of them matched witness descriptions of suspicious people in the area. None of them pinged Webb's instincts as the right suspect. The DNA evidence was compared against all 6 men's profiles on file, producing no matches. Grace's funeral was held on a Thursday afternoon at Highland Presbyterian Church, the same church where she'd been baptized as an infant and where Linda still attended sporadically. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity, hundreds of people spilling into the fellowship hall where they set up a video feed, the community coming together to mourn a girl. Most of them hadn't known personally, but whose death had shaken everyone's sense of safety. Students from DuPont Manual filled entire pews. Teenagers in dark clothes crying for their classmate, for themselves, for the terrible awareness that bad things could happen to anyone. Emma gave a eulogy that she could barely get through, talking about Grace's kindness and creativity and the way she made people feel seen. Tyler sat with his parents in the back, unable to stop crying, looking like he'd aged years in the span of a week. Linda sat in the front pew surrounded by family who'd flown in from out of state, her sister holding her hand, but she felt entirely alone in her grief. She stared at the closed casket covered in flowers and couldn't process that Grace was inside it, that she'd never again hear her daughter's voice or see her smile or watch her grow into the woman she should have become. The pastor spoke about heaven and God's plan and comfort in times of tragedy, but Linda heard none of it. There was no comfort. There was no plan that made sense of this. There was just the endless void where her daughter used to be, and the terrible knowledge that whoever had killed Grace was still out there, still free, still breathing while Grace couldn't. The investigation continued through October and November, Webb following every lead, no matter how thin. But the case was developing the particular frustration of crimes that lack obvious suspects or clear motives. Grace hadn't been killed by someone she knew well, at least not anyone in her immediate circle. She hadn't been involved in anything risky or illegal. She'd simply been a teenage girl walking home from school who'd encountered someone with violence in their heart and opportunity in their hands. Random crimes are among the hardest to solve because there's no connection to trace, no relationship to investigate, just wrong place and wrong time, and a perpetrator who melts back into normalcy afterward. By December, the active investigation had slowed, not from lack of effort, but from exhaustion of leads. The DNA evidence sat in files, compared periodically against new entries in CODIS, never producing a match. Webb kept the case on his desk, kept Grace's photo pinned to his bulletin board where he'd see it every day. He attended the 3-month anniversary vigil held in Cherokee Park, where a small memorial had grown, people leaving flowers and stuffed animals and handwritten notes to a girl they'd never known. He watched Linda place fresh flowers and stand in silence, and he felt the weight of his failure, even though rationally he knew he'd done everything possible with the tools and technology available in 2011. The first anniversary in September of 2012 drew a smaller crowd to the memorial site. Linda was there with Emma and Tyler and a few dozen community members who still remembered, who still cared. The local news ran a brief segment about the unsolved murder, asking anyone with information to contact the Louisville Metro Police Department. No new information came. The second anniversary drew even fewer people. The third anniversary was mainly just Linda and Emma, standing together in Cherokee Park on a September afternoon, crying for Grace and for all the years that kept passing without answers. Linda never moved from the house on Highland Avenue, even though everyone told her she should, said staying there was keeping her trapped in grief. But Grace's room was still there with her artwork on the walls and her sketchbooks on the shelves, and Linda couldn't imagine leaving that behind, couldn't imagine Grace coming home somehow and finding strangers living in her house. It was magical thinking, and Linda knew it, but grief doesn't follow logical rules. She kept Grace's room exactly as it had been, dusted it weekly, sometimes sat on Grace's bed holding her daughter's favorite flannel shirt and crying until she had no tears left. She went to work because bills had to be paid, smiled at patients because that was her job, came home and existed in the house that felt like a shrine to loss. Emma went off to college, staying in Louisville to attend the University of Louisville, partly because she couldn't imagine leaving the city where Grace still felt present. She visited Linda regularly, the two of them bonded by shared grief, looking at old photos and telling Grace stories and keeping her memory alive even as the rest of the world moved on. Tyler transferred to a different high school after his junior year. Couldn't walk the halls at Manual without seeing Grace everywhere. He eventually moved to Cincinnati for college, tried to build a life that wasn't defined by loss, but he never forgot the girl he'd been falling for when she was taken. Detective Webb retired in 2018, his last day at the department marked by a small celebration and numerous unsolved cases that would haunt him into retirement. The Grace Hartley case was one of several cold cases that he couldn't let go, files he kept copies of despite regulations, boxes in his garage that his wife tolerated even though she wished he could leave the darkness behind. He'd review the case periodically, looking for something he'd missed, some connection he hadn't made, but the answer wasn't in the files. The answer was in technology that didn't exist yet, in genetic genealogy techniques that were being developed but not yet applied to law enforcement, in databases that were growing but hadn't yet reached critical mass. The years between 2011 and 2008 were particularly hard for cold case investigations nationwide. DNA evidence was being collected, but if it didn't match someone already in the system, it led nowhere. Fingerprints could identify someone if they'd been printed before, but not if they hadn't. Security cameras existed, but weren't as ubiquitous as they'd later become. Social media was growing, but wasn't yet the investigative tool it would become. Cases like Grace's fell into a frustrating gap. Enough evidence to know a crime had been committed, but not enough to identify who'd committed it. Then in April of 2018, news broke that would eventually change everything. The Golden State Killer, responsible for dozens of rapes and murders across California from the 1970s through the 1980s, had been identified and arrested through a revolutionary technique called genetic genealogy. Investigators had uploaded crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, identified distant relatives of the perpetrator, built family trees going back generations, then worked forward to identify a suspect. It was painstaking work combining genetics and genealogical research, but it worked. Other cold cases started being solved using the same technique. Murders that had been unsolved for decades suddenly had names attached to them. Families who'd waited years for answers were finally getting justice. Detective Sarah Chan joined the Louisville Metro Police Department's cold case unit in 2019, a 30-year-old investigator who transferred from Lexington with a reputation for tenacity and a particular interest in forensic genealogy. She'd been following the developments in genetic genealogy closely, had attended training seminars, had networked with investigators in other states who were successfully using the technique. When she inherited the Grace Hartley case along with several other cold cases in 2020, she immediately saw potential. The DNA evidence from the crime scene was solid, carefully preserved, exactly the kind of sample that could be enhanced with modern techniques and used for genealogical analysis. The challenge was resources. Genetic genealogy wasn't cheap, requiring specialized labs and expert genealogists and significant time investment with no guarantee of success. The Louisville Metro Police Department had budget constraints like every department, and cold cases competed with active investigations for funding and attention. Chen spent months building a case for why the Grace Hartley investigation deserved this investment. compiling statistics about genetic genealogy success rates, emphasizing the community impact of unsolved cases, arguing that solving this murder would demonstrate the department's commitment to justice. Regardless of how much time had passed. In late 2022, Chen finally got approval and funding. The DNA evidence was sent to Othram Labs, a company specializing in forensic-grade genome sequencing that had successfully solved numerous cold cases. The process was slow, extracting DNA from 13-year-old samples, amplifying the genetic material, creating a profile suitable for genealogical analysis. Chen waited through the winter and into the spring of 2023, checking in regularly for updates, trying to manage her expectations because she'd seen cases where the evidence wasn't quite good enough for this technique to work. But in May of 2023, Othram called with news that made Chen's heart race. They had a viable DNA profile. They were ready to begin searching for Grace Hartley's killer. The DNA profile was uploaded to GED Match and Family Tree DNA in June of 2023, and within days the system began identifying matches, distant relatives who shared segments of genetic material with the unknown person who'd killed Grace Hartley. These weren't close matches, not parents or siblings or even first cousins, but third and fourth cousins separated by generations, people who might never know each other existed, but who shared common ancestors born in the 1800s. To Detective Chen, these matches were breadcrumbs leading back through time to family trees that could be built and analyzed and ultimately used to identify a killer who'd walked free for 12 years. Chen hired a genetic genealogist named Patricia Morgan, a retired librarian who discovered a talent for building family trees while researching her own ancestry and had transitioned into forensic work after the Golden State Killer breakthrough. Morgan was methodical and patient, the kind of researcher who could spend 16 hours staring at census records and marriage certificates and find patterns that others would miss. She began the painstaking work of identifying common ancestors shared by the DNA matches, then building out complete family trees showing all their descendants. This meant diving into historical records going back to the Civil War era, tracing families through Kentucky's counties, following surname changes and migrations, assembling a massive genealogical puzzle where each piece represented a human life. The work consumed months of Morgan's time through the summer and fall of 2023. She'd send Chen periodic updates, dense reports with hand-drawn family trees showing multiple generations, highlighting individuals who warranted further investigation based on age and geography. By October, Morgan had identified several family lines that all connected back to central Kentucky in the late 1800s. The challenge was narrowing down which modern descendants from these lines would have been the right age and in the right location to have encountered Grace Hartley on September 23, 2011. The initial list included 73 male descendants who would have been between 18 and 65 that year, far too many to investigate without raising suspicions. Chen and Morgan worked together to eliminate candidates systematically. Men who died before 2011 came off the list. Men who were documented as living in other states in September of 2011 were eliminated. Men who were incarcerated during the relevant time frame were removed. By December of 2023, they'd narrowed the list to 19 viable candidates, all living in or around Louisville in 2011, all with no clear alibis that could eliminate them from suspicion. Chen began the delicate process of background checks without alerting the subjects, pulling DMV records and employment histories and property records, looking for any connections to Grace or the Highlands neighborhood or Cherokee Park. Most of the candidates seemed unlikely for various reasons. Several were elderly in 2011, in their 60s and 70s, possible but less probable given the physical nature of the crime. Several had extensive paper trails showing they were at work or traveling during the relevant time frame. 3 had alibis that emerged from social media posts and digital footprints showing they were elsewhere when Grace disappeared. But one name kept drawing Chen's attention as she worked through the list in January of 2024, a man who not only lived in Louisville in 2011, but whose address placed him within walking distance of both Grace's school and the route she would have walked home. A man who'd been 37 years old in 2011, the right age and physical capability. A man whose background was sending chills down Chen's spine as she dug deeper. His name was Michael Preston, and on paper he looked like exactly the kind of person every community trusts without question. In 2011, he'd been a guidance counselor at Jefferson County Public Schools. Not at DuPont Manual, but at a middle school about 3 miles away. He was married with 2 young children, lived in a comfortable house in the Highlands neighborhood, was active in his church, and known for volunteering with youth programs. He'd been a guidance counselor for 8 years by 2011, working with troubled kids and kids from difficult home situations, praised by administrators and parents for his patience and his ability to connect with students who struggled. He had no criminal record, not even a traffic ticket, nothing that would have ever put his DNA in any law enforcement database. But Chen's instincts were screaming as she reviewed Preston's background, because she'd worked enough cases to know that predators often hide in positions of trust and authority. She pulled his employment records and found he'd worked at 3 different schools between 2004 and 2011, moving every 2 or 3 years, which could be normal career progression or could suggest problems that led to quiet departures before anything became official. She requested his personnel files through proper channels, finding evaluations that were generally positive but with occasional mentions of boundary issues, vague language about maintaining appropriate professional distance with students. Nothing serious enough to derail his career, but concerning in retrospect. Chen discovered that Preston had left his guidance counselor position in 2012, less than a year after Grace's murder, transitioning to a job in educational software sales that kept him away from direct contact with children. His marriage had ended in divorce in 2014. He'd moved from the Highlands to a different neighborhood, then to a small apartment on the east side of Louisville, where he still lived in 2024. His life appeared to have quietly unraveled in the years after 2011, the trajectory of someone carrying weight that others couldn't see, living with knowledge of what he'd done while maintaining enough normalcy to avoid suspicion. The geographical connection was damning. In September of 2011, Preston's house had been on a side street just 2 blocks from Bardstown Road, directly along the route Grace would have walked home from school. Chen pulled traffic camera footage from that Friday, finding nothing useful because cameras weren't as comprehensive in 2011, but she mapped the timeline obsessively. Grace was last seen on security footage at 3:45. Preston's work record showed he'd left the middle school at 3:15 that day, a Friday when he had no afternoon appointments. His house was an 8-minute drive from the school. He could have been home by 3:30, could have seen Grace walking past his street, could have approached her for any number of reasons that would have seemed innocent at first. A guidance counselor offering a ride to a student walking alone. Someone she might have recognized if she'd seen him around the neighborhood, even if she didn't know his name. But circumstantial connections and geographical proximity weren't enough for an arrest warrant, and Chen knew it. She needed direct DNA evidence, a sample from Michael Preston that could be compared to the crime scene profile. She needed to obtain it legally, in a way that would hold up in court, which meant collecting abandoned DNA from items Preston discarded in public places. Chen initiated surveillance in late January of 2024, assigning rotating teams to follow Preston and wait for an opportunity. They watched him go to work, run errands, grab lunch at various restaurants, living what appeared to be a quiet, unremarkable life. They watched and waited for him to throw away a cup or a bottle or a napkin, anything with saliva or skin cells that could yield genetic material. The surveillance was tedious work, hours of watching someone go about mundane daily activities, but Chen had learned patience in her years as a detective. Preston seemed to have no awareness he was being watched, no sense that after 12 years the past was finally catching up with him. He went to work selling educational software, attended occasional meetings, came home to a small apartment and watched television. He had few social connections that the surveillance team could identify. No girlfriend or regular friend group. A man who seemed isolated in the way that some people become as they age, or in the way that people carrying dark secrets deliberately keep others at a distance. The break came on February 8, 2024, a cold Thursday morning when Preston stopped at a Starbucks on his way to work. He ordered a grande coffee, sat in his car in the parking lot drinking it while checking his phone, then finished it and tossed the empty cup in the trash can near the entrance before driving away. The surveillance team waited 15 minutes to ensure he wasn't coming back, then retrieved the cup, carefully bagging it as evidence and documenting chain of custody. The cup was rushed to the Kentucky State Police Forensic Lab with urgent priority marking. Chen felt her stomach twist with anticipation and dread. This was it. Either the DNA would match and they'd have Grace's killer, or it wouldn't, and she'd be back to the remaining candidates on her list, starting over with surveillance and waiting and hoping. The lab processed the sample with appropriate urgency, and the call came on February 14th, Valentine's Day, which Chen would later find grimly ironic. The forensic scientist's voice was professionally neutral, but Chen could hear the significance in his careful words. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from the Grace Hartley crime scene. Not a familial match suggesting a relative, but a direct match, the same person. After 12 years and 4 months, they knew who had killed Grace Hartley. Michael Preston had murdered a 15-year-old girl, and his genetic material had been waiting in evidence storage all this time. Silent testimony that would finally speak the truth. Chen sat at her desk holding the lab report, her hands shaking slightly, feeling the weight of 12 years compress into this single moment of certainty. She thought about Linda Hartley, who'd waited so long for answers, who'd lived in that house with Grace's room preserved like a shrine, who'd never stopped grieving. She thought about Emma and Tyler, who'd lost their friend and carried that loss into adulthood. She thought about Detective Webb in retirement, haunted by the case he couldn't solve. And she thought about Grace herself, 15 years old forever, stolen from the world before she'd had a chance to become whoever she might have been. Now finally, after all this time, there would be justice. Chen spent the next week building an airtight case with Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Martinez, a prosecutor who specialized in cold cases and understood the unique challenges they presented. They assembled every piece of evidence into a comprehensive package, from the original investigation files to the genetic genealogy work to the surveillance and the damning DNA match. They prepared for every possible defense argument, anticipated challenges to the evidence, made sure there would be no room for reasonable doubt. The DNA was solid. The chain of custody was documented. The genetic genealogy process was scientifically sound and had been upheld in courts across the country. Michael Preston had killed Grace Hartley, and they had the evidence to prove it. Judge Raymond Carter signed the arrest warrant on February 15th without hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming, connecting Preston to the crime scene in a way that couldn't be explained away. Chen assembled her arrest team on the morning of February 16th, briefing 6 officers on Preston's background and potential risks. He had no history of violence beyond the murder they were arresting him for. No weapons registered in his name, nothing suggesting he'd resist. But he'd killed before, and they'd take no chances. They'd execute the warrant early morning at Preston's apartment, minimize the possibility of confrontation or flight. Chen barely slept the night before, running through everything that could go wrong, everything that had to go right. At 5:30 in the morning, she was leading a convoy of unmarked vehicles through the dark streets of Louisville, heading toward the apartment building where Michael Preston had lived for the past 6 years, completely unaware that his freedom was measured in minutes. The building was quiet when they arrived, most residents still asleep. Chen's team moved efficiently up the stairs to the 3rd floor, taking positions outside Preston's door. Chen knocked firmly, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the silent hallway. Lights flickered on inside. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal Michael Preston in sweatpants and a rumpled t-shirt, his gray hair disheveled, confusion crossing his face as he registered the badges and the number of officers outside his door. Chen identified herself and informed Preston he was under arrest for the murder of Grace Hartley. She watched his face carefully, studying his reaction. For just a moment there was something, a flicker of fear or maybe resignation, an awareness that this day had always been coming even if he'd convinced himself it wouldn't. Then his expression went carefully blank, and he said nothing as Chen read him his rights and placed him in handcuffs. Preston didn't resist. He didn't ask questions or protest his innocence or demand to know what evidence they had. He was silent, completely silent, as they led him down the stairs and placed him in the back of a patrol car. Chen thought about Grace walking home from school on a September afternoon, thought about this man approaching her for reasons they might never fully understand, thought about the violence that had followed and the 12 years Preston had lived freely while Grace was in the ground. Now that freedom was over, and Chen felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was close, the particular relief that comes from finally holding someone accountable. The arrest made news immediately, the story spreading through Louisville by mid-morning and hitting national outlets by afternoon. Former guidance counselor arrested for 2011 murder of teenager through genetic genealogy. The headlines wrote themselves, combining the elements that always capture public attention. A cold case solved through cutting-edge science, a victim who was young and innocent, a perpetrator who'd hidden behind professional respectability. The story went viral on social media, Reddit threads exploding with people dissecting every detail, true crime podcasts rushing to cover it, Nancy Grace devoting segments to the case. But Chen's focus was on calling Linda Hartley before she heard the news from television or social media. She drove to the house on Highland Avenue that Linda had never left, the house where Grace had grown up, and knocked on the door mid-morning. Linda answered, and Chen watched her face transform as she realized why a detective was on her doorstep, hope and fear and something like terror crossing her features. Chen spoke carefully, telling Linda they'd made an arrest in Grace's case, that the suspect was in custody, that DNA evidence had definitively placed him at the crime scene. Linda was silent for a long moment, her hand gripping the doorframe like she might collapse without it. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Who?" she asked. "Who killed my daughter?" Chen told her Michael Preston's name, explained he'd been a guidance counselor in the school system, described the genetic genealogy process that had identified him. Linda said the name meant nothing to her. She'd never heard Grace mention anyone named Preston, couldn't understand why this stranger had destroyed her life. Chen had no answer that would make it make sense, because sometimes there is no answer. Sometimes evil encounters innocence and destroys it for reasons that will never be rational or understandable. Linda cried then, deep wrenching sobs that came from 12 years of waiting and wondering and living in the horrible space between hope and despair. Chen sat with her, let her cry, said the things detectives say in these moments even though no words can fix what's broken. After a while, Linda asked about the trial, asked when it would be, said she wanted to be there, wanted to look at the man who'd killed Grace and make sure he saw what he'd taken. Chen promised to keep her informed of every step, promised that Preston would be held accountable, that justice would finally be served even though justice couldn't bring Grace back. Preston was arraigned the following day, appearing in court in an orange jumpsuit, looking diminished and ordinary, no longer a respected professional but just another criminal defendant. The charges were read: first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault. Preston pleaded not guilty on advice of his court-appointed attorney, but everyone in that courtroom knew the plea was just procedure, a formality before the weight of evidence crushed any chance of acquittal. Bail was denied. Preston was remanded to Metro Corrections to await trial. His attorney, a public defender named Robert Keegan, filed the expected motions challenging the genetic genealogy evidence, arguing it violated privacy rights and wasn't scientifically reliable. But Martinez was prepared with case law from dozens of jurisdictions where the technique had been admitted and upheld. She brought in expert witnesses to explain the science, demonstrated its reliability, showed that genetic genealogy was now accepted throughout the forensic community. Judge Carter ruled the evidence admissible. The DNA match was solid, and Preston's genetic material at the crime scene spoke for itself. Facing overwhelming evidence, Keegan approached Martinez about a plea deal in August of 2024. Preston was willing to plead guilty in exchange for life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Martinez refused immediately, consulting with Linda, who was adamant that there would be no deal that allowed Preston eventual freedom. Martinez countered with an offer of life without possibility of parole, and after weeks of negotiation, Preston accepted. He would plead guilty to first-degree murder and receive a natural life sentence. He would die in prison. He would never again be free. The plea hearing was scheduled for October 7th, 2024. Linda attended with Emma beside her, needing to be present, needing to hear Preston admit what he'd done. The courtroom was packed with media and community members and people who remembered Grace or who'd followed the case for 12 years. Preston was led in wearing shackles, looking smaller than he had at the arraignment, diminished by the weight of his guilt. Judge Carter asked if he understood the charges and consequences. Preston said yes, his voice barely audible. She asked how he pleaded to murdering Grace Hartley. Guilty. The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. Linda read a victim impact statement that reduced hardened court staff to tears. She talked about Grace, about the artistic, thoughtful, kind girl she'd been, about dreams that would never be fulfilled. She talked about 12 years of not knowing, of living in limbo, of holidays and birthdays and ordinary days that felt empty. She talked about watching Emma and Tyler grow up while Grace stayed forever 15. She looked directly at Preston and said she hoped he spent every day of his remaining life thinking about what he'd taken, about the girl whose future he'd stolen, about the mother whose life he'd destroyed. Her voice broke, but she finished. because she owed it to Grace to speak this truth. Judge Carter sentenced Preston to life without parole, her words harsh and uncompromising. Preston was led away to spend his remaining decades behind bars, and Chen felt something release that had been tight in her chest since she'd first read Grace's case file. Linda stood in the hallway afterward, surrounded by people offering condolences and congratulations, but Chen could see the complicated emotions on her face: relief and exhaustion, and the awareness that justice, while necessary, didn't restore what was lost. Grace was still gone. The years were still stolen. But at least now there was accountability, and perhaps that was enough to finally begin healing. On September 23, 2024, the 13th anniversary of Grace's death, Linda and Emma visited Cave Hill Cemetery, where Grace was buried under a headstone that read, "Grace Marie Hartley, forever 15, forever loved." They stood together in silence, and for the first time since 2011, the silence felt different. Not the silence of unanswered questions, but the silence of peace. Hard-won and imperfect, but real. They would never stop missing Grace, never understand why Michael Preston had done what he'd done. But they had answers now, and they had justice. And that was something. That was enough to remember Grace not just as a victim, but as the vibrant, artistic, kind girl she'd been, a daughter and friend who'd lived fully in her 15 years and deserved to be remembered for her life, not just her death. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment if you've seen justice delayed but not denied in your own community, proving that DNA doesn't forget and time doesn't erase the truth, that persistence and technology can bring even the coldest cases back into the light.